I'm getting the live stream up, heading to the Facebook, all very exciting stuff. All right.
Have you seen Steve Heath recently? I know he attended some of them.
Yeah, no, I haven't. He's in Tennessee these days, but
Right.
he pops on. Let's see. Okay, we are live streaming on Facebook. We are recording. We are doing all of the things. So, welcome,
Cool.
Reverend Ben Collins. Excited to have you with us for
Oh,
Jesus
thank you.
101. I know. This is legit, man. We're doing the thing.
Wow.
So for folks that might be watching that haven't taken the whole journey, we started off kind of talking about in the beginning, what is the mythology of Jesus? What is the narratives and the stories we're familiar with? How are they captured in the different gospels? How do we associate that with the beginnings of creation? So we sort of wandered through all of that. We wandered through the parables Jesus told and how we understand those, the teachings and the actions of Jesus, so the healings and the moving around and the taking the naps and all of those kind of things. We wandered through miracles and talked about how we understand those and hold them. And most recently, we talked about crucifixion, which brings us naturally to resurrection. And I'm excited to have you with us, Ben. Would you give yourself just a little bit of an intro? I know we know each other, but others watching might not.
Yeah, sure. So I am from Central Florida, born and raised, grew up on the East Coast, ended up at Stetson University for undergrad, and then have been in DeLand, Florida, which is a little town between Daytona and Orlando for the last probably 25 years. I've known Katie coming on 15 years from church planting and other stuff like that. In the last 5 years, I transitioned out of full-time ministry into kind of some different disciplines and consulting and philanthropy and grant writing and fundraising and kind of stuff like that. So I've been doing that parallel to some of the ministry work that I've gotten to do with Katie in the last few years. Yeah, so that's kind of me, and I'm sure we'll get into other stuff as we dive into resurrection and life and stories.
Yeah. So I think just to sort of lay a little bit of groundwork because we are calling this a 101 and there may be folks who kind of don't have a lot of the groundwork and Ben, you and I tend to just we'll jump right in the deep end if it's just us. So um
Yeah, for sure.
a little bit of groundwork. We followed Jesus through all of his miracles and stories and all of these things through this period where he is betrayed, he is crucified by the Roman government and religious authorities alike. We're told in the scriptures that he spends 3 days in a tomb, and then, depending on which version, usually women come and discover that the tomb is empty and Jesus isn't there. Now, depending on which version of the story you read, sometimes Jesus approaches and kind of says, "Hey, it's me," or he's just
Right.
missing. Uh, and
Yeah.
so, I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we hold these things. We started in this place a lot of times. Does this need to be a literal understanding, or is there space for this to be a metaphorical? Is one right or wrong? How do you start to think about how to take this kind of story?
Mm, good question. Yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately the answer for me is, the way to start taking any story is humbly. And that's, I think, the acknowledgement that, uh, none of us were there. And if we'd had a video camera, that would not communicate what the four gospels communicate about resurrection because they have agendas. They're written by people, many, many years after whatever the actual resurrection event was. So, they're doing their best with the agenda of their community and with their own theological agenda to make sense of resurrection. So I think we have to hold pretty loosely the probability that we're going to get something right. And I think instead, maybe we can try to hold the faith that we're going to experience something. And I say that as a person who spent, the better part of a decade and a half trying to get it right, trying to figure it out academically and to know the right answer and to understand the Bible right. And I think ultimately, if resurrection is not an experience that we're having, then then we've kind of missed it anyway. But certainly, unpacking it and having these conversations for me is also a part of how it's is real.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that you didn't buy into the binary that I created for you, which was, is this literal
Yeah,
or is this metaphorical? And instead, I tend to find that the answer is yes. There are ways in which this story is quite literal. There were literal human beings having a literal experience together. Now, how it's captured and written down and recorded, there may or may not be, perfect accuracy, but in the end
yeah,
for me that doesn't end up being the main issue. and uh,
right.
and I also think that the idea of resurrection unfolds over and over again, both for these people who are bearing witness to it in this moment, and for the people who continue to sort of celebrate it through communion and these kind of things, year after year for thousands of years, and even sort of echoed in nature. And because of that, I think for me, it's not an either or, but the metaphorical piece of it ends up holding more power for me. Do you think that's true for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if the, um, one of the first years that we started Collective, so this would have been 2015, maybe 2016. I remember that I think I was on vacation leading up to the week of Easter, and that was one of the first years we were doing Sunday Soul Brunch, and it was like a big deal. And I was reading the book, actually called The Book by Alan Watts. And in it, he talks about the idea of, and I'm going to have to paraphrase, I can't remember exactly, but essentially that, we get messages and we get messengers, and so frequently we end up climbing signposts. And I thought that was such a powerful image. And I think, resurrection is supposed to be a signpost that points all people to life. And I think the church has just spent a lot of time pointing at resurrection rather than pointing at the thing that resurrection is pointing at. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what came to me when you asked that question.
Yeah, I think it does make sense, and I think that's for the whole of Scripture, can be an issue
Yeah,
of pointing to the book, pointing
yeah,
to the Bible, to the words, which by the way have been translated and interpreted in many different ways over
sure.
thousands of years by different people, and saying, oh well, it's about the book instead of sort of grasping what that holy book, which can still be holy and be the thing that points to the thing. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that, capturing that. As we think about the resurrection, so one of the stories that's been really compelling to me is that Jesus appears. I'm fairly confident. I'm 100% confident it's to Mary, but he says, don't touch me, don't hang on to me." And I feel like that has always moved me because it's like this is going to be different. And I think there's this difference between resurrection and reanimation. You know,
Yeah.
I think that reanimation doesn't heal us, but resurrection does. And to me, that hold on, don't hold on to me. This is different. We're going to do this in a different way. Be this in a different way. Has always sort of stirred something for me. I'm wondering what pieces of resurrection are stirring you these days, Ben.
I mean, I really like that. I also resonate with that. For me, I think I have a background in sort of hospice chaplaincy and sort of the good gift of letting go. And I do think that that's, our tendency is to, in the wake of a loss, to try to rush back to what was. And I think, if that's the way, if that's what that story is really saying, I think we could all relate to that, desire to hang on to the way things were, before the loss or before the change. And yeah, I think you're right. I think first she doesn't recognize Jesus, and then when she does, he says, don't cling to me. And I think you're right. I think it's don't cling to me in this form. He even says, I haven't gone to my father yet. And the idea is things are still changing, but yeah, it's not going to be the way it was. And I think that's, I don't think that most people in modern Western Christianity necessarily see resurrection as a promise to return to the way things were. But I do think they see it as a promise to accomplish something that they're pretty sure of. And I think it's actually different. Um, yeah, I think it calls for different things.
Yeah. I want to think too. So we always kind of poke at this a little bit with what we know now scientifically, right? So this is thousands of years old, much different understandings of how the body works, how life works, you know, the existence of life, human life, this kind of thing. Um, do you have thoughts about how you reconcile this event of death and then life again with how you understand science and medicine and the way it works now?
Mm. Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, so I think part of my current engagement with resurrection, and I guess maybe the way like I'm uh what's stirring me about it, to your question, is my ability to take it seriously but also hold it loosely. And so I think that for me, uh I probably, a handful of years ago, I don't know, maybe in the last decade, encountered, I don't know who it was. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, someone's theology and kind of language around resurrection being that it's more than literal. And so I think, I'm not trying to make sense of resurrection necessarily as a biological event, because I don't think that would be enough. To your point, I think that would be cool. That would be very impressive. But I also think that would kind of be more like resuscitation. I don't think we're far from that with science. I don't think we're far from, doubling the human lifespan. I think what happened with Jesus is that he was dead, dead, all the way dead. And, something more than literal, I would say something mystical, occurred by which his followers and some of the communities, you know, in the wake of that event, experienced him. And I part of what I love about the Gospels is that they preserve different experiences, of the resurrection, and they're not very similar. Which I think is, so for me, that's why I'm like, I hold it pretty loosely, because I don't think the aim of the scripture is to give us like uh the comprehensive picture of resurrection. I think it's like an appetizer, if that, so that the community of faith can tap into that and have that experience for themselves. Not climbing signposts, but continuing to tap into that energy. So yeah, I'm super duper pro science. I think the stuff that we're doing is amazing. I think we're, probably not far from being able to like, bring back the dead in some crazy, literal and maybe metaphorical senses. But uh to me, I think, especially because of my understanding of, I guess it's process theology, but just sort of the idea that where we are in my understanding of time is that, God's spirit is alive in the church now, and that, for that to be true, the life had to be real, the death had to be real, the resurrection had to be real, and the spirit being turned loose into the church is what we're experiencing now. And so I don't think this is a popular opinion either, but I feel like it makes a lot of sense to me that the church is the second coming. Like, I think there's a lot of people like standing around wringing their hands, wondering when Jesus is going to come back. And it's like, Jesus is back to the extent that the church shows up or not. Um, like, we've got the spirit and we've got the body. I don't know what else we're waiting for. So that's, yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think they are simultaneously like irreconcilable, and they don't need to be reconciled, because they are, yeah, I guess resurrection is a category and science is a way of explaining things. And so maybe one day science will have, the language to explain what happens in resurrection, but I don't think it's any of the things that we've been able to point to in science at this point.
And I hope that science never can. Honestly, I think that would be so
Yeah,
unsatisfying. Like, because I mean, you're probably aware of this. I think it came up
totally.
in our last conversation, last Jesus 101. You know, St. Augustine's not too far from here up north, right? And if you go to the
Yeah,
graveyard in St. Augustine, the oldest graveyard has these little posts with bells that are next to the graves. And the reason was because people were had this disease. It might have been yellow fever, but where they would appear to be dead, so they would be buried, but they would tie a string to their toe so that if they came back to life, they would ring the bell. The dead ringer, that's where
yeah,
it comes from, right? And they could be dug up and
yeah.
you know what I mean? So if that ended up being what
Wow.
resurrection was, I think I would find that entirely unsatisfying. That to me is
Totally.
not a story worth, dedicating a life to, worth following and attempting to live out. And honestly, if it was just some kind of poof magic miracle, that is also unsatisfying to me. That is also
Yeah,
not enough. So I appreciate your language of something more than, literal or more than real, more
yeah,
than biological.
yeah, yeah. And again, I stole that from somebody. I want to say NT Wright, but I don't think it's NT Wright. It could have been Borg. Might have been Marcus Borg.
Yeah.
But they had a lot of conversation, kind of resurrection dialogue, and that came out of it, I'm pretty sure.
Yep. And I feel like we're in an age too where sort of we're watching the decline of institution in a lot of ways, not just church institution, but institution generally in
Oh yeah.
exchange for something that is more sort of compatible to individual needs. We're recognizing different people have different needs and institution doesn't satisfy them in the same ways, whether that's, McDonald's
Yeah.
or the school system or the medical system or the church. And so I think we're moving into an era where there's got to be a right answer, and this is the right answer, and everybody needs to subscribe to the right answer. I'm hoping, honestly, is becoming a thing of the past. Now, what that does open up, though, is, sort of like, okay, so I'm going to give you a Hamilton because I love Hamilton. If you stand for nothing, Burr, what do you fall for? So, where do you start to ground what is important about this if it's not in sort of these irreconcilable items that don't need to be reconciled?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, I think for me, my orientation has always been back towards, you know, the person who shows up on Sunday morning or the person who shows up at a community group and like other than the hour or two a week they give you, they're not spending a ton of time doing heavy lifting theology. And so I think it's, for me, really boiling it down to simple, what is it about resurrection that are like the main ideas? And then what does that, what's the impact of that on our life and our practice? And I think that's, for me, the core ideas that that Jesus died, and I think especially as I've gotten older, died, a political criminal, and died sort of um, a religious outcast, and then was experienced after death, and other people experienced Jesus after death. Um, those are uh, those are foundational for me, and the sort of the promise in that people can experience Jesus after death. So that's maybe what I would say is like the belief in the technology. Like that's what I believe about what happened. Like I think Jesus died, and then a bunch of people experienced him after that. I think it's possible for us too. Um, and then I think the content for me, this doesn't come up nearly enough. This is, maybe the tail end of collective for me. I preach this every Easter. Um, most people I think don't like, they end up arguing about resurrection. What is it? Did it or didn't it happen? If it did happen, what exactly, and how do we explain it with science? And people tend not to focus very much on like what actually happened, like what happened when Jesus was raised from the dead in his interactions with his disciples. And one of the things that I love is that you don't, this is a person who arguably, we've got all these books about 7 minutes in heaven or 10 minutes in heaven or what, people that have died and have near death experiences and they come back and tell you what heaven's like. Jesus is dead for 3 days. He's raised from the dead and he doesn't say anything about where he's been. He doesn't tell us anything new about God. He tells the disciples, he points them back into their own lives.
Mm,
He reminds them of the things. It's like the Eucharist, again, he reminds them of the things that he's been telling them all along, right? It's not new magic information. He doesn't even talk about having been dead and having been raised from the dead. He's in a different kind of relationship, but it's still a relationship. But yeah, he's eating with them, he's talking with them. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's for me, there that message is foundational as well, that resurrection is not primarily about afterlife. It's about how we experience Jesus in this life.
yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that too. And the context with even how those who were there and present, were experiencing this, because I think sometimes there is a big emphasis on, like you were saying, kind of holding this thing literally, or kind of keeping it this event that happened a long time ago and not letting it be sort of a recurring event or a recurring
Yeah.
idea within our lives. And that's one of my challenges with some of my colleagues and things that are a little more literal or fundamental about these kinds of ideas, is that it's like, if you say this one prayer, this one thing that happened 2000 years ago, and now everything is different, and then you kind of don't have to do anything, right? Like you kind of don't have to live any certain, you don't have to have any experience, you don't have to, you know there's nothing
Yeah.
else to it. There's nothing else to teach us about how we live and
Yeah.
experience the world. And so
Yeah.
I'm grateful to point to not only how the folks might have been experiencing then, but how that points to us for how to have an experience now. And I know, I too have done hospice chaplaincy, have had, and I'm going to call it the good fortune of being a part of a number of funerals and celebration of life. Um, may sound a little strange to call it good fortune, maybe not to you, but to
No.
clergy folk. Um, but it is such a beautiful gift to be in a space with people. It's sort of like, to be a little cliche, you don't know what you've got till it's gone kind of thing, and to be in the midst of people bearing witness to how great the love was. And to me, that's
Yeah.
one of the things that's so important about that, it was death, that it wasn't just like Jesus took a nap and then, came
Right.
back and gave a good speech, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that becomes valuable to your life in a different way. It becomes a way of living and not just a story we tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think for sure we spend our lives, week over week and conversation over conversation trying to create moments where people open themselves to meaning, to depth uh and you show up at a funeral and at least half the people are already there every time, right? And you show up at a wedding and maybe a quarter of the people are already there every time. So yeah, those are, yeah, it doesn't, I think for a lot of people, and I think we've changed the language from funeral to celebration of life. I think people are trying to acknowledge, and some of this is, overcoming these misunderstandings of the Bible, that death is not actually the enemy. Death is a part of this creation. Death is the engine of life. If things don't die, new life doesn't come. So, to bring it all back to your point, I think that's how I hold resurrection is not as a hero, but as a guide. And I think that is, includes guiding us into becoming, uh, those kind of people.
Yeah. Okay, so you glanced off of an idea I want to grab hold of.
Yeah.
This idea that something has to die for something else to grow. And I feel like that's really good hard news. That's really hard good news,
Yeah.
both, because I
Yeah.
think you know we live in a world that tells us we can have it all. right? We live in a
Yeah.
world that tells us if we just had the right amount of money, the right medication, the right choices, whatever education, that then we can continue to go in an upward trajectory indefinitely, and that's
Yeah.
how you're doing it right. And what you
Yeah.
just said, and I think what this story tells us is actually that's not the case. Richard Rohr talks regularly about this gospel story is shouldn't be popular because it's a story of downward mobility. It's a
Yeah.
story of heading towards death, towards end,
Yep.
and that can be the very place that something new can happen, but we don't want to surrender anything.
Exactly. Well, we want, and that's the same, look at the other world religions, like that's Buddhism, right? Going from, this guy is like a prince, he's enthroned and he gives it all up, right? And becomes impoverished. And what he learns in that is that he can surrender. And when he surrenders, he achieves enlightenment. So yeah, it's like the same, it is that same downward mobility. And the idea that when we empty ourselves, when we surrender, um, that we're finally open. We're finally open to connect to God, to one another. Um, but uh, yeah, people want the enlightenment without the downward mobility. And that's, a lot of like Richard Rohr's falling upward. People want to be at the top, but they don't want to fall to get there. And that's, unfortunately just not how it works. And I think that's a lot of modern Western kind of cotton candy Christianity is that, resurrection without Good Friday, resurrection without death and loss. And you're right, it's but I also think culturally people like kind of know. I think like the news is out that death is a part of life, and I think that culturally it's going to get less and less popular to be in denial. People are going to have to deal with it in the same way like we're not going to be able to be in denial about the presence of hate and division. Like we're going to have to name these things the same. Like we've got to come to a better relationship with death. And I think um for me, resurrection is a part of that. I think it's a part of like putting grace on the whole process.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on something you also said a couple minutes ago around Jesus doesn't come back and then brag about what happened during the 3 days, the time
Yeah,
the time he spent, the white light he saw, his dad was there, whatever. Um, but
yeah,
so this idea of the 3 days in the Apostles' Creed, it says what happens in the 3 days. It said, and he descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead.
yeah.
So how do you start to think about these various creeds and ideas that indicate what happened in that time, but then Scripture doesn't seem to capture that?
Yeah. After three or 400, I feel like we're essentially dealing with kind of fan fiction in Christianity. So I think the creeds, I like that. I mean, as a workaholic, I like the idea that like Jesus isn't chilling for 3 days. Like he's dead, but he's not so dead he can't still be rescuing people from hell. And I think it was honestly my understanding of it, and I did fine in church history, but it wasn't my favorite subject. So my understanding is that that was trying to resolve a theological problem about grace for people prior to having heard about Christ. So the idea that if everyone needed to call on the name, and there's all these people who, supposedly went and they're burning in hell because they didn't have the chance to hear about Jesus. Well, he's now gone and, taken these poor souls out of hell. That's not a theological problem I have. I don't think that's a theological problem our church has. So, again, I think we've done that a lot in the last couple of years, looking at creeds and being honest about how a lot of the things they say are solutions to problems. They're debates that people are having. So, I like that. I like that resurrection shows up in the creeds because I think it forces us to look at it. And starting with a binary is not bad. And I think saying that, like forcing somebody to say, I believe in the resurrection of the body, and then going, do you or not? And letting them go, no, I don't. And then we go, okay, well, what do you mean? Tell me more. Because that's then you find out kind of what, where are we? But you can start with the binary. And I think the creeds do that well because they're trying to answer that question. Is it this way or that way? So, um, but I like the way Nadia holds the creeds in the sense that I think, a congregation can steward the belief and the practice of resurrection. I don't think, that's on all of us every Sunday. It's a lot.
Yeah. Well, our good friend Steve Heath, whose name you invoked at the beginning of our conversation here, and he would probably give credit to somebody else too, but I recall him specifically saying, you don't have to believe it all at once, which
Yeah,
I just find
totally.
there's so much grace in that for me, or the way that, I've said it myself is don't let the things you can't believe stop you from believing the things you can. So we don't have to
Yeah.
throw out all of our theology, all of our understanding, all of the grace and the
Yes.
love and the work and the, life that is offered
Yeah.
through these teachings and through the scripture in the life of Jesus Christ, because we're stumbling over, is this like actual biological reanimation of cell? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? If we let
Yeah.
that get in our way, it just becomes a stumbling block. It doesn't.
Well, and that's, yeah, totally. And that's why I think, like to your point, I'm much more interested in breaking this down to the component parts because I don't know, the amount of work that it takes to make sure that I'm on the same page as someone else when we say the word resurrection is way more work than it takes for me to say, I think that it's possible for people to experience Jesus after his death. And I think that it's possible to practice resurrection by feeding his sheep, whatever that means. But that's what Jesus says when he comes back from the dead. If you love me, feed my sheep. Doesn't have anything to do with the afterlife, doesn't have anything to do with, I can't remember um, remember the term for it now, metaphysics. It's kind of the same message. It's about love, it's about taking care of the community. So if you're open to the idea that you can experience Jesus even though he's been dead for 2000 years, and you're open to the idea that you can experience resurrection through being a part of a beloved community, that's enough for us to dive into resurrection.
I want to know, Ben, do you ever become concerned? Okay, wait, let me back up. So you were saying how, getting into the dissecting of it isn't as useful potentially as having a common language in which we can start to unpack these things and what they mean for our lives instead of, right? So I mean, like we can both say the word
Sure.
resurrection and that I was going to say
Yeah.
covers a myriad of sins. No, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering, does the common language become problematic at any point when you've got different people with different definitions? And I'm thinking particularly of church cultures that have been harmful to people, that are, you brought up before the idea of hell. And it's like, okay, well, if we don't get this right, then you're
Yeah.
burning in hell. I mean, and there's people who
Yeah.
understand that as a real and literal eternal fate.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if
Yeah.
if you ever worry about the common language being inadequate for communicating.
I mean, I think it is, yes, in one sense, it is inadequate for communicating, I think, issues of resurrection and especially of hell, um, for people whose orientation is supernatural theism, right? For this idea that God is over and above the world and all powerful and intervening and the Bible is literal. Um, yeah, I think without the mystical theological language, it's too much. But I think I think the theology and the form of life that we're sort of advocating for. Um, how did you phrase the question? Am I worried that the common language will?
Will be problematic or even harmful to people.
Yeah, I mean it can be. I mean, I also think some of the, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't totally understand your question. I mean, I know that like I think of the ways that literalizing um is harmful in the sense of like there's, and this is in some sects of Christianity, but I think also in like Mormonism, the idea that there's 144,000 people that are going to be chosen and like resurrected, and so then everyone else is going to burn in hell like that. That's a problem. I think there's, and frankly, there's some stuff about literalizing resurrection, and I understand that there's arguments about the one passage in the Bible that talks about the bodily resurrection. Um, but I think for people who, yeah, it can be a source of real spiritual malpractice, if your orientation is trying to solve riddles rather than care for people. Because lots of people have had loved ones who were lost, missing, disfigured, cremated, and if you've got a theological perspective that's now, making judgments about people that are gone, it's tough. So yeah, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yeah, I mean, there's a cost to anything. I think if there's going to be a cost to not using some of the higher church language, and simplifying it. But I would say that that cost is borne mostly by the church. And that I think the world and the culture will benefit from us being clear about what we're meaning when we talk
Yeah.
about resurrection.
I want to think with you too. So, speaking of cost and that idea that, the over literalizing and, there can be a cost associated with that. I want to think about the other side. I don't know that we talk about this quite as much because it seems less common, maybe in certain circles. But to over figuratize, would that be the other metamorphize? To
Oh yeah.
where this event is only about inviting us into a story of ego death, for example, inviting us into a story,
Mm.
and there's not a real event, and that doesn't matter at all. What matters is that this spiritual transaction can take place within you that results in you becoming enlightened, you becoming the death of ego and the rise of spirit and these kinds of ideas. Is there a point where that becomes problematic?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think ultimately I believe in the power of story, and I think that, um, I think even if the gospel, even if the kernel of the energy of the gospel is ego death, right? Even if that's the thing that, like, in the original blueprint meeting when God was trying to figure it out, what's the thing? Like, well, we've got to solve the ego death. And like, okay, let's go to the drawing board. Okay, we've got Jesus and death. So even if that's the thing, I think that in and of itself is good, but it's not good news. And I think it takes the story of Jesus. I think it takes the human relatability of Jesus to make it a global phenomenon. And so I think and um, yeah, I'm very careful to say more than literal rather than metaphorical. And I like the word mystical because I don't think mystical implies, non-embodied. Um, but I'm a big proponent uh of looking at what Jesus does and says as a resurrected body, um, because it points to categories and ways of being that we don't understand. And we haven't seen Jesus in the Gospels walk through walls. We haven't seen Jesus with wounds. And yet Jesus is eating. Jesus is multiple times not recognizable, in his resurrected body. So, that stuff's very important to me because there's a lot of theological significance for it. So to me, I'm not ever stepping back and going, oh yeah, I'm Christian in the sense that like we've all got to get over ourselves. I think for me, it's ground, and even, a few years ago, Bart Ehrman, who's a famous atheist biblical scholar, wrote a book where he basically said, look, Jesus is a real historical figure, right? There's a bunch of yahoos out here who are, trying to say that Jesus didn't exist. So 100% Jesus existed. There's no question about that. And the trajectory of the life and the teachings in the way that we're presented with in the Gospels, like we started with, is there a theological agenda on the lips of all the gospel writers? Absolutely. And is that in service to communities of faith back then and communities of faith now having experiences of this resurrection? Yeah, I think so. And I think we find that there.
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of saying in no way is this proper grammar, but the truthiest truths uh, are echoed in multiple ways, right? Are you can grab them in multiple ways. You can see them reflected in nature. You can see them as literal historical events. Watch them unfold there. You can watch it unfold in your own life, in your heart. You can watch it unfold
Yeah.
in your community. That it gets echoed in all of these different ways. And for me, that's I think the most impactful way that I bear witness to what resurrection means. I think anybody who's experienced any kind of dark night of the soul, now it doesn't have to be like John of the Cross, who's locked in a tower and starved for, ever endless amounts of time. But I think most people that have reached even our age of life, Ben, have had some soul crushing moment they've been exposed to, some moment in their lives that where they questioned whether it was worth it to live, where they've questioned, you know, if they have any value, questioned, is any of it worth it?
Right.
Through these hard moments, I think when we're quite young, hopefully we don't ever ask those questions, but as we age and go through various kinds of death, whether it's the death of a reputation, the death of a marriage, the death of a loved one, just the death of what you thought life was going to be like. I don't think you
Yeah,
get past 40 without having some version of, life isn't what I thought it was going to be like.
totally.
And even though that's not doesn't hold the same sort of gravity that the idea of the death and resurrection that Jesus walked through, in some way it helps me tolerate it. It helps me tolerate my own I don't want to say miniature deaths because I don't want to diminish them in that way, but the times in which I feel crushed, the times in which I feel like there's no hope. To have a story of somebody who went through the darkest hour and that wasn't the end of the story. To have somebody whose story is, they didn't win, man. He didn't win. Like this
Yeah,
is the story. The good guy loses, basically.
yeah, yeah,
And then there's another chapter. So when I feel like my story is the good girl's losing, or whatever version of that,
yeah,
there's something powerful and palpable about resurrection in that moment.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I had not thought of it in terms of recovery, but I know we both have recovery backgrounds, and I think, yeah, there's, the the moment of bottoming out, um, and having experienced that, the my God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah, everyone's had that moment. And I think, the stats on suicide and depression and isolation are staggering. So people are having those moments all the time. Um, and you know, to be able to identify with Jesus and that story, that sense of absence followed by life, even on the other side of that, to be able to look around a, recovery room and see people nodding along and know that there's life on the other side of whatever it is you're sharing. Um, yeah, I think that's, I think the truth of resurrection is much more like, walking into a recovery room for the first time and saying, hi, I'm Ben, I'm an alcoholic, than it is, 10 years down the road, everybody's celebrating and well, and everybody has jobs. And, I think, uh, the kingdom of God is the end. I think resurrection is like just the moment on the other side of bottoming out. Um, And I think that's a lot, for a lot of people, that's all the hope they need. It's just that that it's not over, that people have been where you are. You're going to get past it. Yeah, God is out in front of you.
Mm, yeah. I hadn't thought of it necessarily specifically in recovery terms either, but in thinking of, this first step, powerless and
Yeah.
unmanageable. There's not much more powerless and
Death, death, death.
unmanageable than crucifixion, right? I mean, then,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
um, do you feel that it's important that Jesus be sinless as we talk about resurrection? And in some theological circles and thinking, it's so important that Jesus was sinless, that Jesus was perfect, because then that makes this sacrifice and then, next life, rebirth, resurrection, that's what makes it matter. Does that feel like an important concept for you, or how do you start to unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important concept just in that it's a part of the tradition. I mean, I think that's a part of the mechanism of, like sin and salvation and all that kind of stuff. I would say I might hang on to the core mechanism, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I think, for me, that I don't need Jesus to be sinless because I think sinless is language that ties the significance of resurrection to a purity cult. And saying that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were salvific insofar as Jesus satisfied some sort of purity cult. I'm not a purity theology guy. I'm a redemptive theology guy. So if I was going to say there was any impurity, it would not be in any sort of personal piety. It would be impurities in terms of how we treat one another. And so yeah, I'm okay with that mechanism, but not the like personal purity cult kind of thing. I'm more on the justice side.
Yeah. Well,
Um, yeah, so no, I don't know. I don't need Jesus to be sinless. I don't, I'm not a literalist. I'm not a substitutionary atonement. you know. So yeah, I
yeah.
honestly haven't thought about that in a long time though. So good question.
Yeah. Well, and that's part in some of our episodes we've had folks who grew up with some of that theology share some of it. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes because of the work that you and I do, we forget how prevalent that is. That
Yeah.
that's the story walking around. And I have a friend who came to me crying one day because she had a sibling who many years ago had committed suicide, and she was convinced that that meant that that sibling was
Hmm.
forever damned and was
Yeah.
burning in hell. And she was just so distraught many years later, not just with the grief of losing somebody you love and care about, that's enough, but also with this idea that you know that meant that you were
Yeah.
damned eternally. uh,
Yeah.
and I appreciate coming back to that, because I do think there's a lot of people for whom their faith is still based in a certain level of fear and a certain level of need of all
Yeah.
of this substitution, that God needs a sacrifice. That's the kind of God that we have, is one that needs a
Yeah.
sacrifice
Yep.
because we're so bad.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's another one of those kind of gross mechanisms where we try and make the good news bad again. I think resurrection is supposed to be another sign that we're okay. That all is well. And I think, absolutely leave it to evangelicals to go, look how great resurrection is, right? You better hope you believe that Jesus was sinless or it's not going to work. It's like, my goodness. Okay, yeah, I totally agree. I think uh along with the redemptive theological orientation is a hopeful theological orientation rather than fear-based. And I think that, those questions around qualifying resurrection ultimately lead back to fear.
Yeah, I agree with you, friend. Well, any other last thoughts here? We're coming to the end of our time. Anything that didn't get said about resurrection that would be helpful for our Jesus 101 crowd?
Yeah, yeah, actually, so I just searched for this, and I will share this kind of as a closing thought. I mentioned it just a second ago, sort of the justice implications of this, but this is a quote from our good friend Pete Rollins. Let's see if I can get this up on the screen where I can read it. Okay, so I just love this. This is ending on a hyper practical note. So, one of my buddies, Pete Rollins, who's a philosopher and theologian out of Belfast, Northern Ireland. I think he's back in Belfast now. He was over in California for a while. This is a quote from him from, it's got to be a decade ago because I quoted him a decade ago. Uh, he says, without equivocation or hesitation, I fully and completely admit that I deny the resurrection of Christ. This is something that anyone who knows me could tell you, and I'm not afraid to say it publicly, no matter what some people may think. I deny the resurrection of Christ every time I do not serve at the feet of the oppressed. Each day that I turn my back on the poor, I deny the resurrection of Christ when I close my ears to the cries of the downtrodden and lend my support to an unjust and corrupt system. However, there are moments when I affirm the resurrection. Few and far between as they are, I affirm it when I stand up for those who are forced to live on their knees, when I speak for those who've had their tongues torn out, when I cry for those who have no more tears left to shed.
Wow. So much, that's a powerful word. So much grace in that too. Once again, I feel
Yeah.
so grateful to have a theology that says the answer can be yes and no.
Yeah.
And not mean that in a light, paltry giveaway kind of
Yeah.
way.
Wishy
So,
washy. No.
yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't cheapen the grace that's offered to us through this idea of resurrection, through this idea of
Yeah.
hopeful new life, but actually deepens it because it makes it more, use your word, practical, realistic, possible. Can
Yeah.
I believe, every single day in the same way with the same gravity?
Yeah.
I can't. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm lately at this stage of my life grateful and frustrated that it is in the hardest moments that the death and resurrection is most palpable, is most real to me, that God, that Jesus, that all of it is most real to me because I think what I want for my life is to feel good and be happy all the time.
Yeah.
My most powerful experiences of the divine aren't in those places, usually.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And maybe that in itself is a kind of resurrection, a redemption at least.
Yeah. Well, and I think, maybe the idea that we can't put our hand on what a resurrection body is precisely the idea that, it's beyond what we're going to be able to imagine, and it takes faith just to let it happen. And that's, trying to imagine what life after the thing you're going through is kind of futile. It's going to be different and better and just unimaginable, but
Mm.
you just got to get through the thing you're in.
There was a line in a prayer of confession that I was a part of one time, and it said, "You will be made whole beyond your wildest dreams."
Mm. Yep.
And for me, it was powerful not because it didn't say you'll be made happy beyond your wildest dreams or wealthy beyond
Yeah.
your wildest dream. You will be made whole,
Yeah.
in ways you can't even imagine. Like that's something worth living your life in response to,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
ways that, a sacrifice of a perfect, to appease an
Yeah.
angry God is not compelling to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Being sinless is not on anyone's to-do list in the modern world. Um, like the good news has to have something to say.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you this just anecdotally, even my own kids, who have the great benefit of being exposed to my profound thoughts around theology. But that, my son in particular will sometimes say things like, Mom, I'm not sure I would like this heaven place. It's got all these stiff, judgmental people there. Seems like all the
Yeah.
cool people would be in hell. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh man, you know.
Yeah.
So this idea of this
Yeah.
sinlessness and how that's become strictly defined based on whatever cultural conservatism or I'm glad we
And
don't
it's
put lies
gonna,
in that.
yeah. Well, and that's part of what I mean. Like, I don't, it's just, it happened a lot quicker than I think the church anticipated. But it's just, if you're not in the church actively, that language is just gone from our culture. Like, I took Joe to a to an Easter sunrise service. Uh, and it was pretty standard evangelical, substitutionary atonement stuff. And like, she left and she's like, what was that? Like, my initial response is, I just wouldn't want to be Christian. And I was like, yeah, that's, like it didn't say anything to her other than negative. It was like,
Mm.
yeah, we got to tell a better story, man, because it is good news. But you know, we've put up a lot of things that obscure the good news, I think.
Mm. Well, Ben, I'm grateful that you're on a part of the team of tearing some of that down, deconstructing
Yeah.
it, participating in resurrection,
Yeah.
and redemption. And I mean,
Yeah.
I'll go one more time with Richard where he says, all things, all things will be resurrected.
Yeah.
All things end in resurrection. All things are redeemed. And I think
Yeah.
that's the place that gives me hope that, even the worst thing we can think of, God can somehow find some way
Yeah.
to make
I
it.
can think of a few.
Well, thanks so much for your time. It's always good to chat with you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, for any friends that are watching online, either live or later on YouTube, if you have questions or comments or ideas that come up, if you are provoked by something you've heard and want to know more, please drop a comment or send an email or a Facebook message or a YouTube message or however all those things work. And we'd be glad to be in touch and follow up. And hope
Yeah,
you'll
come to
have
church.
some
Come
questions.
to
Yeah.
church. Yeah, if you've got questions, come. And if you have a question, bring it up in the affirmation or the prayers of the people. Say, hey, I was at Jesus 101 and you guys talked to, or I listened after the fact and you guys talked about this. What did you mean by that? Come and ask a question. We'd love to chat with you.
Oh, I'd love a good question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that wraps up another
We
episode of
did
Jesus
it.
101, Resurrection Edition. And we have one final remaining episode where we will talk about the Trinity. So that should be
Ooh,
interesting. How
fun.
does Jesus play into the
A
Trinity? So,
lot of roar.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, have a good night, Ben. And
All
anybody else
right. You as
watching,
well.
take care and be in
Bye,
touch.
friends. All
Bye.
right. Bye bye.